Okay, in this video, I want to talk to you guys about cellular transport. Okay, transport obviously means to move something from one place to another. You guys should be familiar with that. Well, in cellular transport, we're talking about moving molecules in and out of the cell. In and out of the cell. Okay? That's what's being transported. It's different molecules. They could be water molecules, they could be sugar molecules, salt molecules, lots of different molecules, okay? But just moving them in and out of the cell is cellular transport. This is one of the most important activities that goes on in a cell. There's two major types. There's active transport and there's passive transport. Now, to give you a better idea of the difference between these, let's see if I can give you an example here. Okay, imagine these are balloons. If you want to blow up a balloon, you have to actually do something. Okay? A balloon lying on the table will just lie there. It won't blow itself up, right? You have to pick it up and actually force air inside it. Air doesn't naturally go in there and inflate the balloon. So you're having to actually do something. Okay? You're forcing air in, and that means you're using energy. You're having to actually do something. It means you're being active. And that's all we mean when we talk about active transport, is it's transport that requires energy. It has to be active. You have to do something to make the transport happen. In this case, to make air go from outside the balloon to inside the balloon, you have to put forth energy and be active. By the same token, if you have a balloon that's already inflated and it's full of air and you let it go, well, what happens is the air will rush out of the balloon. Now, it will do this without you doing anything. Okay, you don't have to actually do anything. Sure, you could squeeze the balloon, but you don't have to. If you leave the balloon and just let it go, the air will naturally just flow out on its own. So it doesn't require inner energy. And that allows you to be passive. And all passive means is that you're not having to actually do anything. It's the opposite of active. Active, you're doing something. Passive, you're not actually having to do anything. Okay? Does that make sense? Hopefully so. So let's go back and look at this. So active transport, we could say that that's transport that requires energy. It requires energy. Okay? And passive transport is no energy needed. No energy needed. You say it kind of happens naturally. Alright? That's where something moves in and out of the cell just on its own. The cell doesn't actually have to do anything to move it in and out. Okay, so before we get into these in detail, let's talk a little bit about how the cell does, how things move in and out of a cell. Now, if you remember from class, you know that cells have a cell membrane. Okay, so let's have us a cell membrane here. Okay, if this is the cell membrane, you know that it surrounds both plant and animal cells, although plant cells might have a cell wall around here in front of it, but the cell membrane is what we're talking about. The cell membrane, if you were to zoom in on it, okay, if you were to take a little portion of the cell membrane and blow it up really big, okay, would see some really funky looking little deals that look sort of like this. Okay, so that's what the cell membrane looks like if you were to zoom in on it right here. What these little things are that look like this, these are molecules that are called phospholipids. Okay, these are phospholipids. And phospholipids have a unique quality. Okay, that unique quality is that they have a head and a tail. The head has a quality, has a characteristic called, we describe it as hydrophilic. Okay, the head is hydrophilic. Let's kind of move this out of the way for just a minute. Here. Okay. The tails, the little tail parts right here, are hydrophobic. Okay. Now a little grammar lesson here. I always tell you guys that learning Latin, learning some of these little different phrases and stuff will help you identify words. This is a good example of that. It comes from the word hydro, meaning water, and philos, which means love. Okay? Just like a bibliophile is somebody that loves books, or a technophile is somebody who loves technology. Phile means love. So hydrophilic means it loves water. Whereas over here we have the same root. We have hydro, which means water. But we have phobic. Just like a phobia. What's a phobia? It's a fear. So that means fear. So you've got a head and a tail on these phospholipids, one of which loves water. The head loves water on each side. You have hydrophilic heads, and you have tails that fear water. Okay, so if you notice, there's two layers here. There's one facing in and one facing out. Okay, one's facing inside toward the cell, one's facing away from the cell. We call that a bilayer. So the phospholipid is a bilayer. Bi meaning two, and then layer, two layers, right? Phospholipid bilayer. The area in between the bilayer right here is where the hydrophobic, here, let me color it the same color. This is no water. There's no water in this area, okay? This area does not like water. It's hydrophobic. Yet you have water on the outsides because this is the hydrophilic side. Hydrophilic side loves water. So you can have water on the outside. And the fact that this the cell membrane is designed this way is the reason why molecules are able to pass into and out of the cell. It's not a solid wall. It's made up of this phospholipid bilayer, and stuff can get between here, especially small molecules like oxygen molecules and water molecules. Okay? Alright. So, we call this quality, we say that the cell membrane the cell membrane which is made up of this phospholipid bilayer, is semi-permeable. Here comes another little grammar lesson for you. Semi means partially, like a semicircle is part of a circle, okay? So semi means it's not the whole, not everything. Permeable comes from the same root as permit. If you permit someone to do something, you allow them to do something. So you can think of semi as part or some, okay, not all. To permit means to allow. And then it's got able on the end. So it allows some. It doesn't allow everything to pass through, but it allows some molecules to pass through. Semi-permeable. Okay, a semi-permeable membrane is what the cell membrane is. And that'll come up over and over again. So that's one that you should know, is that it is a semi-permeable membrane. It's made up of a phospholipid bilayer. The phospholipids have heads and tails. The heads are hydrophilic. The tails are hydrophobic. Okay? So let's close that up and let's talk a little bit now about the actual transport, since we talked about the membrane that it passes over. All right. We're going to talk first. Oops. We're going to talk first about passive transport. So this is transport that happens, and the cell doesn't even have to do anything. It just happens naturally due to the laws of physics. Okay, laws of physics dictate that this is going to happen. All right, passive transport, for the most part, is based on the principle of diffusion. And what is diffusion? Well, diffusion is just a fancy way of saying, a simple definition would be stuff moves from crowded areas to less crowded areas. Okay, if you've ever set off a stink bomb, you understand what this means. Here's how. Okay, let's say you're in the corner of a classroom over here, right? Corner of a classroom, and little Johnny in the corner here, he sets off a stink bomb, a real nasty one. And these little green dots represent the stink molecules. Okay? Well, those stink molecules, when he first sets it off, will be concentrated in this one area because that's where the thing exploded. Now, the rest of the room doesn't have stink molecules in it, does it? All right, so the rest of the room over here, see if I can draw a little room here. Alright, so the stink molecules start off right there in that part of the room. But we know that the rest of the room doesn't have any stink molecules. These stink molecules will naturally, without anybody having to do anything, they will slowly spread out till they fill all this empty space. Because they move from an area right here that's more crowded, okay, move from an area that's more crowded to an area that is less crowded, which means everybody in the rest of the class is going to get to smell that stink bomb pretty soon. All right, as these molecules spread out. And things tend to do this. Okay, particles and molecules, they tend to go from areas that are more crowded. When you have a bunch of them, it's called a high concentration. Okay, more crowded. Another way of saying that is high concentration. It's related to density. We've talked about density, right? Okay, you got a high concentration here. It's going to move to an area of lower concentration. That's just a fancy way of saying crowded, more crowded and less crowded. It's going to go from high concentration to low concentration. And it'll do this till the concentrations are even. Okay, so one side's not more crowded than the other. These molecules will spread out in the room till they're completely even. Okay? That's what diffusion is. And you notice it doesn't require any energy or any effort to do it. Those molecules will automatically spread from a place more crowded to less crowded on their own. Well, this is the way it happens a lot of times in cellular transport. Okay, when you breathe in, if you have little alveoli here, we've talked about those in the lungs, right? Little alveoli. They got little blood vessels crawling all over them. Okay. What are those alveoli full of when you breathe in? They've got a whole bunch of oxygen molecules inside them, right? So these alveoli are full of oxygen molecules. There's a high concentration of oxygen, okay, in your alveoli when you breathe in. Okay. Now, the blood that's coming in over here, the blood in the blood vessels is deoxygenated blood, which means that it's got, okay, the blood has a low concentration of oxygen because it's already been used by your body, right? This is deoxygenated blood. So what happens is these oxygen molecules naturally, without any effort, flow from the alveoli into the blood to balance out the concentration of oxygen molecules. Okay, so it's the process of diffusion. That's how it gets in there. Okay? Okay, so diffusion is the main type of passive transport. However, we're going to talk about a little special thing here called osmosis. And that's a word I'm sure lots of you have heard. It's a popular word. And all osmosis, if you want a definition for osmosis, it is the movement of water, so I'll put H2O, through a semi-permeable membrane. Okay, so like the cell membrane. All right, movement of H2O through a semi-permeable membrane. Now, the thing that makes it special here is we're going to talk about what happens to the water inside and outside a cell when you place it in a solution. For example, okay, first of all, you need to understand that on any given cell, let me just draw a quick little cell here. We'll just draw, we're not going to get all fancy with it. There's my little cell with a nucleus, okay? Cells, they have water outside, all right, and they have water inside. Cytoplasm is mostly water, okay? So you got water outside and inside a cell. All right? Now, that water is not usually pure water, okay? Either inside or outside the cell. It's usually some sort of solution. For example, it could be saline, it could be salt water, it could have salinity in it. When you put, depending on the solution outside compared to the solution inside, water will either move into or out of the cell. Let me explain what I mean by that, okay? you could put a cell. Let me just clone my little cell here. Get it all. There we go. All right, let's say this cell right here is placed in a solution, and the water on the outside has a high degree of salinity. Okay? And there's a lot of salt molecules in it. And let's say the water inside the cell, it has salt molecules too, but it doesn't have nearly as many. As you can see, I only have a few salt molecules inside the cell. I got a whole lot of them. So this solution has more solute in it. This solution has more salinity. Okay? What will happen? This is called a hypertonic solution. Okay? And in a hypertonic solution, you have more molecules, more particles outside than you have inside. So in this case, salt molecules, you have a lot more of them outside than you have inside the cell. That's putting the cell in a hypertonic solution. In that case, water will flow from inside the cell to the outside of the cell. So in a hypertonic solution, water leaves and the cell shrinks. And they can completely shrivel up and die, depending on how long they're in the solution. Okay? Another type of solution another possibility is, let's say you have a cell that is the opposite situation. Okay? Let's put us a whole bunch of salt molecules inside here. So the cell has a bunch of salt molecules, and the water outside the cell, it's got a few, but it doesn't have nearly as many as they're not nearly as many as inside the cell. Then what will happen in that case is water will flow from outside the cell. Notice I'm not talking about the salt, I'm talking about the water. Okay? The water will flow from outside the cell to the inside of the cell. This is called a hypotonic solution. I know these can seem really confusing. But hypotonic is when there's fewer particles outside the cell than there are inside the cell. In hypotonic, water enters the cell, and the cell grows or expands, and it can actually expand to the point where it will pop. So if it doesn't find a balance in the solution, cells can actually die this way. They'll swell up until they pop because they'll keep filling up with water. Remember, this is passive transport. The cell's not wanting the water to come in or wanting the water to go out. It just happens because of the physics. And it's complicated physics. You don't have to worry about it right now. But because of the number of particles in here, if the particles in here are bigger than the number of particles outside, water will flow in. If the number of particles outside is bigger than inside, water will flow out. And it's going to be important to remember the names because they're similar. Hyper, hypo. All right? We'll try to come up with a little mnemonic to remember that at some point. And then, of course, the last situation would be one, we say the best for last, right? The happy one. The happy little situation where the, the number of particles outside the cell and the amount of particles inside the cell are equal. And in an equal situation, it's called an isotonic solution. And the cell and the water stays the same. Water stays. Okay? So nothing happened. The water doesn't leave the cell. It doesn't go into the cell. It just stays the same. So if you put a cell in a solution and it shrinks up and shrivels up, you know you've put it in a hypertonic solution. If you put it in a solution and it swells up and gets fat and maybe even pops, you know you put it in a hypotonic solution. If you put it in a solution and it just sits there, you put it in an isotonic solution. Okay? So these are this is, of course, osmosis because water is moving into and out of the cell across a semi-permeable membrane. And then we'll move on to active transport. Now, active transport, this won't take too long. We're almost at the end, don't worry. Active transport, oops. Remember, we just talked about that active means you have to use energy. So this is transport. This is stuff moving in and out of the cell that the cell wants to happen, that the cell, well, I say that, the cell doesn't actually want anything, but that the cell uses energy to do. So it uses energy. Now, the basic thing you have to know about this is the cell uses proteins to move stuff into and out of the cell, move molecules into and out of the cell. An example of this might be the what's called a protein pump. And without getting into the details of how it happens, a protein pump, it uses energy to pump or to push molecules into areas of high concentration. Okay, so in other words, it's doing the opposite of diffusion. Diffusion happens naturally, right? You have a high concentration, you have a whole bunch of something, it's going to spread out to areas of lower concentration. Well, the protein pump, it uses energy so it can move stuff into areas that already have a high concentration. Okay? So it's doing the opposite of diffusion. And because of that, it uses energy. Now, energy is in the form of a little molecule that makes this protein pump work called ATP. Okay? ATP is the energy that it sells. This molecule is the fuel that makes the proton pump work, and that's active transport, and it's very important. Probably the most important one is called the sodium potassium proton pump, and your cells use this proton pump a lot. A lot of the energy that you take into your body is used in the sodium potassium proton pump. It pumps sodium out of the cell, and it pumps potassium into the cell. So even though you have a concentration of sodium outside the cell, it actually uses energy to pump more sodium out and potassium into the cell. This is real active in neurons and all types of other things. Your body doesn't work without the good old sodium potassium protein pump working. Alright? And that's mainly the only thing you need to know about active transport, is that it uses energy. Example would be a protein pump which uses energy to push molecules into area of high concentration. It does the opposite of diffusion. So if you understand diffusion, then you should be good on active and passive transport in cells. All right.